At 76, Meryl Streep finally said the one thing fans never expected to hear. After a lifetime of silence, she revealed the man who held her heart above all others. It wasn't a co-star. It wasn't her late husband. It was someone no one saw coming until now. The confession that shook Hollywood. At 76, Meryl Streep finally said it out loud, something she had held in her heart for over 4 decades. In a moment of rare emotional openness, she revealed that Robert Redford was the one she never forgot, the one who touched her heart more deeply than anyone else. "He was the best kisser I ever worked with," she said, and the world stopped to listen. There was no scandal, no secret affair, no exposed romance, just a truth, quietly spoken, that shook Hollywood to its core. Meryl and Redford were never a couple, not officially. Yet, in her voice, you could hear the weight of a love that never faded, one that didn't need labels or permission. It was something deeper than physical, more lasting than headlines. "He understood me," she added, 5 words that said everything. The media went wild, but this wasn't about drama. This was about a soul-level connection, the kind you carry with you through marriage, children, awards, and loss, and still think about decades later. In her heart, Redford had always been there, a gentle shadow, a what if she never chased, but also never forgot. Her love for him wasn't loud. It was steady, hidden, unshakable. She wasn't betraying anyone. She was simply human, and brave enough to say it. And with that one quiet confession, Meryl Streep reminded the world, some love stories are never lived, but never die. The river scene that revealed everything. It was just a scene, but it became something unforgettable. In Out of Africa, the moment where Robert Redford washes Meryl Streep's hair in a river isn't just iconic. It's electric. There's no script strong enough to explain what was captured in that frame. Because that wasn't acting. That was something real. Years later, Meryl admitted it was the moment she never wanted to end. "Even with hippos nearby," she joked, "there was magic." Her words weren't just nostalgia. They were an acknowledgement that something powerful happened under those African skies. Director Sidney Pollack saw it too. He said their chemistry wasn't rehearsed. It was natural, almost uncomfortably intimate. Between takes, they'd disappear into conversation, laughter, moments that no one else could quite understand. And Redford? He called their connection effortless, like breath. The way they looked at each other, the softness in their movements, the calm, the trust. It didn't feel like performance. It felt like memory. And audiences could feel it. That scene has since been studied, replayed, and immortalized because it doesn't just show romance, it shows truth. Meryl never confirmed the full depth of what she felt, until now. But that river scene said it all. It was never just a movie moment. It was a love letter sealed in film, captured in silence. And in that silence, we saw it. A story not written in tabloids, but whispered in glances, and remembered forever. Behind the scenes, a bond that defied time. On screen, they were magnetic. But off-screen, Meryl Streep and Robert Redford were something else entirely, something even stronger. They were kindred spirits. During the filming of Out of Africa, cast and crew noticed it immediately. Between takes, while lights were reset or cameras repositioned, Meryl and Redford weren't tucked away in trailers or scrolling through lines. They were together, wandering off, laughing, talking quietly. There was an ease between them that couldn't be rehearsed, because it wasn't. Director Sidney Pollack once said, "You couldn't direct what they had. It just existed." There were no grand gestures, no need for confessions. The way they looked at each other, the way they moved around one another, was intimate without being obvious. Like two people who had discovered something rare and silently agreed to protect it. They didn't need labels, didn't need to be seen. Because the connection was so real, it didn't depend on public attention. What made it more powerful was that it lasted. Years after the cameras stopped rolling, Meryl would still speak of Redford with the kind of affection usually reserved for lifelong partners. She called him the most generous co-star I've ever had, and the kind of man who listens before he speaks. And Redford? He called her disarming in the best way. There's a moment, long after Out of Africa wrapped, when Meryl was honored at an awards gala. The cameras caught Redford in the audience, watching her with a half-smile, eyes soft. He didn't clap first. He didn't cheer loudest. He just watched her, as if no one else was in the room. People who saw that clip years later said the same thing. He didn't look like a fan. He looked like someone who knew her soul. Their relationship was never made official, but that never mattered. Because some bonds are bigger than headlines. They stayed in touch, quietly, privately, as friends, colleagues, and something more subtle, emotional companions through the madness of fame. It wasn't about timing. It wasn't even about love in the traditional sense. It was about recognition. The rare moment when two lives brush up against each other and create a space so personal, so honest. It doesn't need to be explained. And Meryl carried that bond with her, not in rings or records, but in moments, conversations, memories. Theirs wasn't a romance people could understand, but it was love all the same. A long marriage, a quiet tension. Meryl Streep married Don Gummer in 1978, a relationship rooted in respect, creativity, and partnership. Together, they built a life full of art and family. They raised 4 children. They stayed out of tabloids. They lasted. By all accounts, it was solid. But even the strongest marriages carry quiet spaces, corners of the heart where unspoken feelings live. And in Meryl's case, Robert Redford quietly existed in one of those spaces. It was never scandalous, never reckless, but it was there. Meryl herself admitted in one rare moment, feelings aren't betrayals. They're part of being human. That one sentence said more than any tabloid ever could. She wasn't unhappy in her marriage. In fact, she often spoke lovingly of Don, his artistic soul, his support during her early rise, and his ability to let her shine. But Redford? He was something different. He wasn't the man who helped build her life. He was the man who opened her heart in a different way. It's not uncommon to have a life partner and still remember someone who once stirred your soul, but most people never speak it. Meryl, at 76, finally did. And in doing so, she changed the narrative around love. She reminded the world that you can be devoted to one person and still quietly carry another in memory. That doesn't make the love you live a lie, it just makes you layered. And maybe, just maybe, part of what kept her marriage strong was that Don Gummer understood that. He gave her the space to feel fully, even feelings that weren't about him. But over time, distance began to grow. Their last joint appearance was years ago, and by 2023, a quiet statement confirmed what many had suspected. They had been separated, not angrily but respectfully, for over 6 years. No drama, no headlines, just a mutual pause. And while no one dared say it aloud, the question hovered in the air. Had Meryl's heart drifted toward the one she never truly let go of? The hidden spark that lingered for decades. Long after Out of Africa left theaters, long after award seasons came and went, Robert Redford's name never really disappeared from Meryl Streep's world. It would show up quietly, in interviews, award speeches, even casual conversations. Meryl never gushed. She never made headlines with bold declarations. But if you listened closely, his presence never left. She once called him her "what if." Just 2 words, soft, almost whispered, but they carried an entire universe of unspoken emotion. To some, it sounded like nostalgia, but to those who knew her work, her words, and her stillness, it sounded like longing. Meryl is not the kind of woman to exaggerate. Every word she gives the public is carefully chosen. So when she calls someone the best kisser I've ever worked with, people pay attention. When she says, "There was something about him that just stayed with me," you realize she meant it. Fans picked up on it, slowly, over time. Her face would soften when asked about Redford. Her tone would change. Not dramatic, but intimate. It wasn't performance, it was memory. And the timeline? It's quietly revealing. In the 2010s, Meryl's interviews about Redford became more frequent. Never romantic, never inappropriate, just sincere. One journalist wrote, "It's like she's trying to tell us something without saying it directly." Then, in 2023, came the announcement. She and Don Gummer had been separated for over 6 years. It wasn't messy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was timed just months after yet another resurfacing of her reflections on Redford. That proximity didn't go unnoticed. It raised a question, not of scandal, but of timing. Had the end of her marriage finally freed her to speak a truth she'd carried for decades? And what about Redford? Though he never publicly confirmed the same emotional weight, he always spoke of Meryl with deep affection. Once, Pripulsi, when asked about her, he smiled and said, "Meryl is rare." It was all they ever gave us, whispers, side glances, and poetic truths tucked into press junkets. But somehow, that made it even more real, more honest. Because not all love stories are meant to be lived. Some are meant to be felt, quietly, eternally, and without need for conclusion. The truth about her separation. When Meryl Streep confirmed in 2023 that she and her husband Don Gummer had been separated for over 6 years, it wasn't just news, it was a revelation. The world had assumed they were still together. For decades, they were the model of stability in a town built on temporary love. No scandals, no shouting matches, just art, family, and dignity. So when the quiet press statement dropped, noting the split had been amicable and private, fans were stunned, but even more curious? The timing. Because just months before, Meryl had publicly reflected on her time with Robert Redford once again. A soft mention during an interview, a story about Out of Africa. A moment where her eyes drifted, not toward the past in regret, but toward something she clearly still carried. And that's what made people wonder. Was the announcement about her marriage really about closure? Or was it something else? After all, 6 years is a long time to be quietly separated. Why announce it now? Some believe it was because she was finally ready. Ready to speak her truth, not to scandalize, but to honor a love she'd protected for decades. Maybe she wanted to make space, not for a new relationship, but for emotional honesty. Even Redford's name, always treated with delicate respect, seemed to rise more frequently in her stories. And it was never about romance, it was about connection. Insiders hinted that she had been attending more private retrospectives of Out of Africa, that she'd been invited to a tribute Redford couldn't attend, that his absence felt heavier than expected. And so in 2023, with one short statement, she closed one chapter, not with bitterness, but with grace. Because the real story wasn't about a breakup. It was about a woman reclaiming a quiet truth she had carried for a lifetime, and finally, allowing herself to speak it. Redford's role in Meryl's emotional legacy. He was never her husband, he was never her partner, but Robert Redford shaped Meryl Streep's emotional legacy in a way no headline romance ever could. To the world, their bond began and ended on screen in Out of Africa. A sweeping love story under African skies, full of longing and heartbreak. But for those who looked closer, the real story wasn't just in the script. It lived in the silences between scenes, in stolen glances, in the kind of chemistry you don't rehearse, you remember. Behind the camera, while lights were being reset and microphones adjusted, Meryl and Redford were simply themselves. No performance, no crowd, just two actors who saw each other with rare clarity. Redford saw her, not just the world-renowned actress, not the multi-award-winning icon, but the woman beneath, the one who carried grace like armor, who navigated life's weight with both elegance and fire. And Meryl saw him too. Not the heartthrob, not the Hollywood royalty. She saw the man behind the legend. The man who carried stillness like a secret language. The one who didn't speak much, but meant everything when he did. Their connection wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Years later, when Meryl was asked about her most impactful collaborators, she always paused at Redford's name. Her voice would soften. Her eyes would flicker with something unsaid. "There's something about Bob," she once said gently, "that you just don't forget." Redford's affection was quiet, but constant. In a rare interview, he called Meryl disarming, adding, "She doesn't try to impress you, and that's what makes her unforgettable." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't scandal. It was depth. It was two artists recognizing each other, not for fame or ego, but for what they were beneath it all, real, complex, and profoundly human. Their moments weren't for cameras. They walked side by side after scenes wrapped, trading thoughts about life, not work. They shared coffees, not headlines. They gave each other a kind of emotional safety that rarely exists in the entertainment world. Director Sidney Pollack, who watched it all unfold, once said, "You didn't direct them. You just let the camera roll and watched something real happen." Redford wasn't a lover. He wasn't a chapter. He was a through line in Meryl's emotional narrative, a quiet companion in memory, a muse without demands, a mirror without judgment. In a world that measures love in rings and timelines, Redford was something else entirely. A permanent echo in her emotional landscape. The kind of connection you don't act on because it already lives inside you, forever. When love lives without labels. Meryl Streep's story with Robert Redford breaks every rule we've been taught about what love should look like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It wasn't about rings, public appearances, or living in the same house. And yet, it lived, fully, deeply, and undeniably. There was no affair, no scandal, No tabloid headlines or secret rendezvous, but there was something else. Something real and incredibly rare in the world of fame. A quiet connection that stretched across decades, surviving time, marriages, and the silent spaces between their lives. In a world where celebrity love stories are often put on display like a show, Meryl and Redford did something extraordinary. They kept it sacred. No performances, no interviews, just a bond that stayed tucked away in the safest corners of their hearts. And that's exactly why it meant so much. To them, and now, to us. When Meryl finally spoke at 76, she didn't need drama to make an impact. She just said the truth, that Redford was always there in her mind and spirit, a presence, not a possession. And with that, she validated something countless people feel but never say out loud. You don't have to be together to be in love. Redford wasn't a chapter that ended. He was the backdrop to so much of her emotional life. He wasn't a what could have been. He was a constant, a quiet echo, a reminder that some souls simply recognize each other, even if life never lets them walk the same path. They were never lovers, but they were more than friends. What existed between them didn't need a name, because it lived beyond labels. In shared energy, mutual respect, and emotional memory. And that might be the most meaningful kind of connection of all. Meryl once said, almost in passing, "Not every great love has to be lived. Some just stay with you." And that's what Redford was for her. Not a regret, not an absence. A spiritual companion, a safe place in her memory. A love that didn't end, because it never even had to begin. In an age obsessed with answers, with timelines, with closure and clarity, Meryl and Redford offered something else. A reminder that some of the deepest love stories don't follow rules. They don't need declarations or even definitions. They just exist, timeless, quiet, and stronger than most will ever understand. What fans can learn from Meryl's revelation? Meryl Streep didn't just share a secret. She opened a window into the parts of ourselves we often keep hidden. At 76, she didn't chase attention, didn't demand headlines, and certainly didn't turn her quiet truth into spectacle. She simply said what her heart had carried for decades. Robert Redford had been the one man who stayed in her heart, even if the world never knew. And in those few words, she gave her fans something far more powerful than gossip. She gave them permission. Permission to feel deeply, even when that love never grew into something official. Permission to carry someone in your heart, even if you've lived a full life without them. Permission to be human, imperfect, emotional, and honest about it. She didn't disrespect her past. On the contrary, she honored it. She spoke with warmth and dignity about her long marriage to Don Gummer, a partner who walked beside her for decades, who fathered her children, who built a life with her rooted in love and commitment. But she also acknowledged something rarely said out loud, that not every emotion belongs in a tidy box. That some connections never fully go away, not because we cling to them, but because they became part of us. Her words struck a chord because they reflect something most people never say, but almost everyone has felt. We've all had that one name that still lingers in the mind, that moment that never quite got a proper ending, that glance, kiss, or unspoken bond that never turned into a life, but still changed ours. It's not about scandal. It's not about infidelity. It's not about regret. It's about the complexity of love, how it shapes us, challenges us, and sometimes stays with us long after it's gone. Meryl reminded the world that emotional truth isn't always linear, that you can love more than one person across a lifetime, that feelings can live quietly beside loyalty, that memory doesn't always equal disloyalty. Some feelings, as Meryl seemed to say without saying it, aren't meant to be acted on. They're meant to be remembered. In a world obsessed with closure, her revelation offered something gentler: acceptance. Because love doesn't always follow rules. It doesn't always fit inside a marriage or a relationship. Sometimes, the most lasting loves are the ones that came without conditions, the ones that simply were. Meryl's revelation wasn't a grand confession. It was a soft truth, a whisper to every person who has ever wondered, "Is it okay that I still feel this?" And in that moment, she gave us all permission to let go of shame, to make peace with the echoes, to realize that feelings aren't flaws. They're proof that we lived, that we loved, and that some people stay with us even when they don't stay beside us. The legacy of a love that never ended. Robert Redford is gone now, but for Meryl, he's never truly left. She doesn't talk about him often. She doesn't need to. The way her voice softens when his name is mentioned, the way she smiles when Out of Africa is brought up, says it all. This wasn't just nostalgia. This was a soul bond. In her final interviews of recent years, she described him as the one who stayed with me in ways that didn't require words. And maybe that's the greatest kind of love, the kind that never asked to be anything, but still became everything. Their story didn't end in a wedding. It didn't end in heartbreak. It didn't end at all. Because some loves don't live in chapters. They live in the margins, in glances, in the memory of a river scene no one could ever forget. Meryl's confession doesn't close a door. It opens a window into the beauty of quiet connection, of what happens when two hearts meet and stay joined without needing a map or a name. Years from now, when people talk about Meryl Streep's legendary career, they'll mention the Oscars, the roles, the impact. But behind it all, behind the fame and the films, will be one name always glowing softly in the background. Redford, the co-star, the constant, the quiet love that never left. Meryl Streep's quiet revelation wasn't about drama, it was about truth. In just a few words, she reminded us that love isn't always loud or perfect or public. Sometimes, it lingers silently in the heart for decades, shaping who we are without needing recognition. Her honesty gave permission to so many who've loved deeply, privately, and without regret. At 76, she didn't just name the man she loved most. She taught us that holding on to a feeling isn't weakness. It's life, it's memory, it's real. And in that truth, Meryl gave the world her most human moment yet.